Welcome to Evident's third virtual roundtable of 2024. Today's topic is leadership, which is actually one of the more contentious elements of our methodology, because leadership is at the same time very important, but also very difficult to measure. When it comes to communicating AI strategy, the actual words matter. Words help signal AI maturity to a mix of stakeholders such as investors, customers, the media, employees, and prospective AI talent. Sustained structured disclosures on AI signals an ability of the bank to provide regular updates on their AI investments, but also return on these investments. But as the index demonstrates, not all words are the same. Not all communication strategies are the same, and not all banks are the same at demonstrating leadership, no matter what goes on behind the scenes. So today we're going to dive into 1, how do we define leadership? 2, what have we found in the latest cut of our data? And 3, bring in some experts from the industry to help us provide insight and context that we don't get from the data alone. As ever, please do put any questions that you might have in the chat, and we'll get to them either as we go or towards the end of the session. We have set aside some time for a Q&A towards the end. I'm really excited to have James Utting and Ken Usdin with us today, a leader from banking, to sit down with a prominent equity analyst. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute and a bit about their background. But we're excited to get their perspective on how do we explain as a bank an AI strategy, and how do we decipher an AI strategy from the outside. So I'll hand over to you, James, first, and then over to Ken.
Thanks, Alexandra. So James Utting, I'm working at UBS in my 18th year here. I'm currently operating as the Chief Business Officer in our Group Emerging Technology function. In that role, very involved in shaping and implementing our group's AI strategy. Prior to my pivot towards AI, the formative years of my career were spent operating as a COO on our trading floor in the equities business. I love what you guys are doing here, and I'm really glad to be here today. So thanks for having me.
It's terrific to have you, James. And over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Alexandra. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name's Ken Usdin. I cover the large cap banks and equity research at Jefferies, a role that I've held for over 25 years in total. Have a little experience also at the Federal Reserve early on in my career. We cover everything that banks do and care about from a stock price perspective, ranging from how they're dealing with the macro environment to interest rates, credit quality, but also encompassing how their spending goes in terms of what they're doing with their technology and digitalization, et cetera, and where AI has very much come into the fore from our perspective of watching banks in the market.
Ken, terrific to have you, and great. Thank you for joining from New York. It's a pleasure to have you. What we're going to do in terms of flow is that I'm going to tee it up, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Colin, who's going to take us through some of the latest data. And then we're going to take a break when the sub-pillars have been introduced, and then go to questions to James and Ken. But we are actually probably just worth mentioning, we're only 30 days out from the next release of the Evident AI Index. It's our 3rd edition. We are on an annual cadence, and we're going to be releasing the index on October 17. Just as a reminder, this is measuring the AI maturity of the 50 largest banks in North America and Europe. So that's landing on October 17. Just to maybe also note that the leadership report was just published. It's the first publication to leverage the latest cut of the data that goes into the index, and a great proxy for the degree of change and momentum that we've observed across the sector at large. So do download it. If you haven't already read it and seen the latest data off it, do go to our website and have a look. Just to sort of tee it up and to discuss what we are looking at and what we're talking about when it comes to the leadership pillar itself. So what we look at here is that we look at two aspects. We look at the AI narrative, and we look at executive positioning. And what do we mean by that? On the volume side here, we look at how an AI strategy is communicated through the various channels that the bank has at its disposal. And that would be investor relation materials, press releases, and company LinkedIn posts. So we look at, what is, and where are the AI sort of strategy mentions being made visible from the bank. But we also look at the substance. So it's not just how much is a bank talking about AI, but it's very much about the substance too. Can a bank talk about the actual spend, number of use cases in production, and the return on investment of these use cases? The more specific that banks are, we found actually the more mature they are, because so much goes into being able to communicate that specificity of detail of what the bank is doing. But then we also look at executive positioning, and we look at how that is communicated from the top, what the CEO is saying, and how that is then also amplified through the C-suite of the bank. And finally, we also look at what is the who sits on the executive committee, and how is that structured, and how is that changing over time. A lot of that has also to do with the ease of moving AI use cases through to production of the bank. So looking at how that leadership and executive committee is changing over time is very important for the leadership pillar. So with that, I'm actually going to hand over to Colin to take us through some of the questions that we're going to address and the data that we're going to be looking at.
Thanks, Alexandra. Colin Gilbert, I lead evidence intelligence team and was responsible for producing this report in conjunction with my colleagues on the data science side and the client services side. Full disclosure, the leadership report was the first publication I worked on over a year ago when I joined Alexandra and Annabelle's Pirate Crew, and it is my favorite report. So I was really excited to bring in our panelists early into the discussion and really look at what we're measuring and why. I think Evident holds ourselves to a very high bar in terms of our ability to defend the robustness and integrity of the methodology. And to that end, we always open these sessions with an honest, no mercy, no malice critique. So James, I think I'll go first to you, and then I'll follow up with Ken. I'm curious, when you're looking at how we define leadership in terms of what we're measuring in the Evident AI Index, what do you think we missed? What do you think we're not measuring? Or do you think we're overestimating or underestimating the importance of some of these things? And most importantly, do you think what we're trying to capture on this single slide feels like it's gaining traction within the industry before we dive into the supporting data? James, first to you.
Thank you. Well, like you said, you've got a high bar. Last time I counted, there were, 20 odd different indicators that you had feeding into this. So it's pretty comprehensive. So a couple of points, but I would sort of label them as maybe being nitpicking. So the first one, I think the way that you focus on company LinkedIn posts sometimes excludes some of the leadership people. So maybe C-suite or maybe spokespeople for AI could be considered. I'm sure it's something you've thought of already. The second piece is, I know certainly for us, and I'm sure this is true for many others, a lot of our leaders spend and invest a lot of time in very important discussions with industry bodies and forums. Perhaps not all of the records of those are public, but where they are, that might be an interesting avenue to pursue. The one bigger sort of thing that I have when I step back from this is less about what are you capturing, but more about how it influences the index. I think the leadership pillar is 15%, talent 45%, innovation 30%, and responsible AI at 10%. I think that made sense a couple of years back. And I think it made sense then where AI was still fairly niche, both in banking and society more broadly. And then came the launch of GPT and generative AI. And actually the need for an AI strategy seems to have moved from perhaps seen by some as a novelty to now being a necessity. And along that, also people are thinking about the impact that AI can now have is actually greater than perhaps they realized it was before. So I think now the gap probably from those driving AI organizations to the C-suite has likely reduced. Therefore, the substance, and you measure this in terms of volume and substance, I think the substance, and you see this from your leadership report recently released, has materially increased. So my question back to you is 15% the right weighting? Or is there a rebalance to come up at some stage?
And James, I think that depends entirely on which bank we're talking about. But I'm going to go to Ken and ask a slightly same question, but maybe phrased in a slightly different way, which is, Ken, as obviously a research analyst for a long time, I'm curious. You approach your analysis of banks from the outside in with a very different tool set. But we're using a lot of the same documentation in terms of investor relations materials. So what's familiar in this methodology? What's different? And how does that relate in what you're trying to profile from financial KPIs to what we're trying to profile in terms of AI maturity? Might be good for the audience to hear.
Yeah, and I think I was going to dovetail a little bit off of what James ended with, which is the timeline that we're on, because the thing that I think about next is results. And to steal an evidence term, evidence. And that's where you go from substance of the narrative to proof points and deliverables. And to me, that still connects very much to the whole leadership concept. If you're going to be a leader and out there and communicating the strategy and putting it forward, then it's one thing to have estimates of business impact, but we like to look at proof points. There's the inputs and then there's the outputs. And I think what's very tricky about this, and we just alluded to it, is that, and we'll get more into this, I'm sure, is that the time continuing of who's ahead and who's behind is going to be very fluid. But when I think about just one institution, from where its start point is to where its middle point is to where its end point is, I'm thinking about what was the stated case, and then how does that come along for the ride? And then what are the true, examples of where that, proof of concept has turned into results, not just estimates, but literally like on the ground. We've done this, we've done that. This is where it's live. This is where it's moving. So to me, that's the logical evolution of the next step.
Yeah, and I love this theme of where we are in the timeline, right? Because Evident really is capturing a snapshot in time through a ton of metrics that are normalized at a particular time in the year. And I think that James' comment on what's the driving factor in terms of waking up the C-suite to the importance of being active in the conversation versus Ken's point about how people will be held accountable once they put something into the public record is really what is driving a lot of what we're seeing in the base data. So I want to keep the discussion going, but let me give you, a very brief cursory data dump of what's in the report so that we have kind of the raw materials by which to kind of respond to in a productive way. This was the state of play in the last ranking published in November 2023 with regards to the top 10 banks in the leadership pillar and their breakdown across the two sub-pillars. We're not going to dwell on this very much because this leaderboard will effectively be obsolete in the next 30 days when we release the new edition of the Evident AI Index ranking. But two quick observations that I think are fairly important. One is that only 5 of the banks at the top of the leadership pillar are also one of the top 5 banks in the overall ranking when we incorporate the talent metrics and the innovation metrics and the transparency metrics. So there's weak correlation between overperformance in leadership and everything that we're necessarily ingesting. At least there was in the past. The other observation is that only 5 of these banks perform really well across both sub-pillars, AI narrative and executive positioning, as described by Alexandra. And so our jumping off point is that last year, it really felt like we were profiling a cohort that hadn't found firm footing yet. And in this year's updated release of the leadership report that was published 10 days ago, those trends and insights really help validate this point of view. So what's changed year over year? First, we've observed a massive spike in the number of AI mentions across the board. Banks are mentioning AI or related terms 62% more frequently in annual reports, 22% more frequently in press releases, and 83% more frequently in LinkedIn. In fact, across the board, if we sum total all of these AI references, you're looking at 60% lift across all direct comms channels, totaling over 1,250 references or 25 references per bank per year. So, but it's not just kind of the volume that's increasing. What we're also seeing is that banks are starting to coordinate their messaging better across distinct channels and platforms. So all 50 banks that we track in the index now make at least one AI references across one of these channels, and 35 now make AI references across all 3 channels concurrently, up from 26, or only about half of the index. So compared to last year, it feels like the conversation has shifted from, should we do that? Should we be putting that out there? Should we be publishing that, to a radically different open question among the C-suite, which is, why aren't we doing that? That looks easy to do. Why are they doing that, but we're not? And so I don't know. Despite what I tell my son, I think that maybe at the end of the day, peer pressure is a wonderful motivator for some of these institutions that we're examining. But I would be remiss if I didn't also point out what the data is telling us, that, you know, more volume in and of itself doesn't mean much, because after all, more noise without substance is just that. It's empty calories, or worse, it's AI washing. But the second trend that we observed helps give us kind of peace of mind in the fact that there's also an increase to the substance of what banks are talking about. With investor relations materials, you know, what Evident does is that we grade each AI reference against a 4-point scale, with the highest points in the dark blue, kind of level 4, reserved for banks that A, describe AI as a group level strategy, 2, identify active AI use cases at the bank, and 3, highlight the outcomes of those use cases in terms of measurable business impact. And last year, over half the index, 27 banks, weren't talking about AI initiatives within the bank in any level of detail. They didn't mention AI anywhere. They referenced it only in terms of an industry trend, or they discussed it in relation to the bank at a very cursory level. And as a result, you know, the bulk of the index was really graded at level 0-2 in our assessment rubric. This year, it's completely flipped upside down. The number of banks that score in that low range has plummeted from 27 banks to 8 banks. And conversely, the number of banks at the top in terms of the quality or the substance of what they're disclosing has jumped from 6 banks to 15 banks. And examples of what we're ingesting are available on the right-hand side of the slide in terms of what you see in Tessa Sampalo's 1H FY24 results, is that they're talking about how this relates to strategy. They're documenting the growth in use cases. They're documenting the number of AI specialists that are bringing these AI use cases into production. But most importantly, although it's in fairly small print, they are actually putting a number on the additional contribution to 2025 gross income that they had not reported previously. And that's important because, going back to Alexandra and Ken's points on outcomes, one of Ken's peers or colleagues is going to ask on the next earnings call, what happened to that $100 million number? Where are you tracking on that? So once you put it out there, you can never basically take it back. And we think that that signals by proxy confidence in their likelihood of the banks to keep talking about this once they join the conversation. Finally, and very, very briefly, last observation is that the overall trend that we're discussing has regional variation. We'll be writing actually more about this in the brief on Thursday, but you know, banks in the UK represent the most improved geographic cohort when we're looking at AI mentions. They went from being the second quietest region next to France last year to the second loudest region behind APAC this year. And if you look at that dramatic jump or that course correction, it comes down exclusively to the fact of how many UK banks went from a passive to an active posture in their communication strategy. Last year, 3 UK banks failed to publish any LinkedIn posts regarding AI at the bank. This year, LinkedIn posts from UK banks spiked 6x, press releases spiked 3x. And more than anything, it just underscores the fact that we're no longer comparing chatty brands to silent brands with null values. Everybody at this point, to one degree or another, has joined the conversation. So what we're talking about today and what the leadership report is talking about today is what does it mean to be part of the conversation, and what is the caliber of that dialogue at the end of the day. So I want to really, pick the assorted kind of brain power on our panel today. And again, I want to go to James as kind of a representative from the industry and ask, why do you think we're seeing this uptick, not only across volume, but also because of substance that's being communicated? And I think you talked about that a little bit in terms of that wake-up call with regards to Gen AI earlier.
Thank you. So I guess let's step back. Big picture, AI is now a cross-industry phenomenon. It's everywhere. It's in healthcare, pharma, retail, transportation. You choose your industry, people are talking about it. There's also a cultural shift. AI is no longer seen as niche. It's fast becoming mainstream. Dare I say, it's now broadly accepted. If that's too far for some, at least some of the fear factor has sort of been diluted around AI. So let's then bring these back to banking. Banking, you have customers. They're curious. They're demanding of transparency. So are your regulators. So there's a need to be communicating some of this stuff. Banks are in competition with one another. So they're seeking to differentiate themselves from their customers and to investors and then analysts like Ken. And then we're also looking at it from a future-proofing perspective. People aren't looking necessarily at AI just as a, how do we do something this year, but it's how do we pave the way for success in the outer years, whether that is readying ourselves for growth or that is preparing for margin compression. But banks are looking to AI as one of the tools to be able to do that. I think most importantly, though, and many people on this call will concur, is that substance takes time to build. You can't actually just come up with this stuff overnight. To get organizational consensus, get agreement on something of such strategic importance, you need deep thought, collaboration, and you need the right top-down support. So that takes time. So the trends that you showed earlier on that, on one of the prior slides, in terms of the substance and volume, I actually think they're likely to continue to improve in next year's index as people go up that AI maturity curve.
Ken, do you feel that organically kind of in the earnings calls? Our data shows that we just hit the inflection point of 28 of the 50 banks mentioning AI regularly. So it's just continuing to go asymptotic in a small sample. But do you feel that quarter on quarter within the calls that you're involved with?
Well, so yes, I would break it down into a couple different components. There are a few banks that are now just making it a part of their intro and including like strategic stuff. And that's very easy to do in your prepared remarks. And it's also very easy to do in like industry conferences. Because the more you get big picture and strategic, the more likely it is you're going to talk about technology and you're going to talk about digitalization and automation. And now it's very easy to throw in a bullet about how AI is going to become a part of that. However, I want to come back to a point that you made, Colin, about my colleagues asking. My colleagues are asking. I'm personally not, but my colleagues are asking. And in the leadership report, in fact, you'll see one of them even stack ranks as one of the top executives, which is interesting because he's an analyst. But certain people make that a priority and actually almost cause it because certain people actually flush that out throughout an earnings season and ask the same question. So that's one way of making it come out more relative to when, especially when you get on an emerging topic like this. So this happened, for example, this happened with ESG a few years ago. It happened with the cloud a few years ago. So it starts with like a groundswell of just becomes real, and then all of a sudden it becomes in the conversation, and then banks start talking about it, and then analysts start asking about it more. And that's kind of where we are. There was just an industry conference last week, in fact, and it was one of the standard questions asked by another one of my colleagues. So it's become real enough that is now becoming a clear question point that is coming up in the dialogue, especially as you talk about the combination of technology, expenses, investments, et cetera. So that absolutely is a direction of travel that we are seeing.
And then, Ken, a follow-up question is, can you comment on whether or not you think the industry is providing the analyst community with enough material to assess progress over time, which we just talked about? And maybe another way to also phrase that is that it feels to us we're ingesting a lot of different materials, some of which would be considered more classic marketing and communications than investor relations. And there's a different rubric by what you put into which documents, depending on what level of scrutiny it is going under. And so to what degree do you and your colleagues need to expand the aperture to, play detective and suss out from the executive voices what they are and are not saying very strategically?
Yeah. So, this could go a lot of different ways, but what I would start with is just that I think the time continuum is not evolved enough to make comparisons across peers. I am not at the point where I am saying someone's a negative because they haven't blown out their AI discussion as much as someone who's already put a number out, like you just showed on the prior slide. But I want to amplify that with a real-time example. So last week at the investor conference, JP Morgan President and CEO Daniel Pinto spoke, and he talked about specifically the benefits from AI. And a year ago, he had said that would be about $1 billion to $1.5 billion a year benefit, and which at the time was a very big statement for any bank to make. And I would safely say that I think it was the most meaningful at the moment. And last week, he actually updated that and said he thinks it's now closer to $2 billion. Now, later on in the presentation, he also said that Wall Street estimates for net interest income were a bit too optimistic and that estimates for cost growth were a bit too low, and the stock was down 7.5% intraday. So I got to step back and still say this is a part of a bigger discussion about bank fundamentals, and we're not at anywhere near a moment where there's a price to press release type of notion here. It is a part of an important discussion around the evolution of banks, but the macro environment that banks live in and the details of how they're navigating that from a revenues and expenses perspective at this point in this life cycle is just much more meaningful to the stock prices than is the increase in the magnitude of the disclosure and the discussion around AI. Over time, that's going to change, I think. But just to give you that real-time example from last week.
I think that's a really important point because, as James was saying, substance takes time. But I think once you also have the substance, then it becomes a choice of whether or not this helps or hurts against all of the other factors, Ken, that you were just listing out that go into evaluation and movement on the price performance, obviously. To James, to turn it back to you briefly, one way to ask that is, are banks seeing external value in documenting ROI, or more to the point, what is the risk and the reward about documenting highly proprietary information through use cases in greater detail? Surely there's an upper limit to that from the industry perspective.
Like the first part of that, honestly, I find quite hard to answer. I don't really have much of a view on the value piece. The risks and reward piece, I've definitely got some thoughts on that. I'm going to do it in reverse order. So the rewards, really good at building trust through transparency, whether that's customers, regulators, or investors. People like to see what you're up to. They like to understand what's going on. It's good for attracting talent. People see it and they want to talk to you about, saw you at that conference talking about that, saw that press release, really cool. I want to work somewhere that does something like that. I would like to think it helps with investor confidence because they're seeing the sort of digitalization and the automation mindset that is coming through. And then sort of more broadly, it's quite rewarding in terms of influencing the views of the industry, showing that banks aren't purely using AI for profit, for example. They're using it for more rounded purposes, something you guys are doing a nice job at evidence showing and helping with. It's not without risk, though. So what you put out could be word perfect, but still subject to being misinterpreted by the audience that look at it. That's a risk. What you put out could mean you're leaking IP. It could mean that you're putting some valuable, but importantly, really easy to copy ideas out there. Some of the best AI I've seen is actually some of the simplest applications of it. So sharing that and celebrating that might be great to give yourself a pat on the back that you've done that. Actually might mean that you've just let all of your neighbors and all of your peers do exactly the same thing the next day. And then within the kind of world AI, you always have people talking about the slightly cliched fail fast mentality. Failing fast is kind of good, but you don't really want to do that in the public domain. You don't want to put something out this quarter which doesn't exist next quarter. Certainly you don't want to put lots of things out this quarter that don't exist next quarter. So you've got to be really careful to temper that enthusiasm, and you mentioned right at the forefront for your son, the peer pressure that everyone else is doing it, should we, to make sure you have a very balanced view of what it is you're putting out into the public domain.
Yeah. I want to stay on peer pressure just for 1 second, because we got a good audience question from Ollie, which asks, I appreciate that Evident might not be currently collecting the data from a cross-sector perspective, but wondering if the panelists have a view of banks' AI progress vis-a-vis other industries. And so I think the way I would phrase that is, are there role models that you look to or create a litmus test, whether that's manufacturing or advanced sciences or aerospace or anything in your radar that you look at internally and say, this is what good looks like when we're not looking left and right at our immediate peers? Either Ken or James, either of you want to risk commenting on that one?
I would just say that's such a hard question for an industry-specific analyst to answer. We did a series here at Jefferies called Early AI Innings early this year, where each of us put forth that exact prognosis or thought process about our own specific industry. But one of the things we realized is that this is all living in such silos across the even financial subsectors, much less the rest of the market environment. And I find it very difficult to even pinpoint an industry that would be quote unquote better or worse relative. I think that they're all learning from each other. I think there are good practices being developed across the marketplace and of course across the corporate environment. And I think that's just an evolutionary process as well, where it's very hard for me to say that like banks and financial services companies are either ahead or behind, other industries.
Fair enough.
I think I'm not going to tell you if we're better and worse than any other industry, but where looking across is very helpful. Sometimes is when you're challenging opinions that people have. So often in banking, not specific to AI, but with any use of technology, there's this rhetoric that we're very highly regulated, so it's harder or impossible for us to leverage that type of technology. Look across to healthcare or pharmaceuticals. They're highly regulated and they're able to use it from the beginning of their product journey all the way through to the end, including how they report back to their regulators and how they make their disclosures. So people have proven that, yes, it might make it slightly more challenging for good reason, but there are other industries that do it, and hopefully that demonstrates to people within this industry we can do it too, both those in the industry and those regulating the industry.
Fantastic. And Alexandra, I want to make sure we have time to talk about executive positioning, and I'm always nervous to ask you this question because you have strong opinions with regards to the UK banks. But I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that regional anomaly we saw regarding kind of the lights coming on in full force with regards to the 5 UK banks that have traditionally lagged on some of these metrics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Colin. I also actually had a question back to James on the regulation. I'll just give you the question and then I'll discuss the UK banks, and then maybe James, we can go back to you. But what we hear on this, obviously we've seen a sea change. You can see that in the data. But what we still often hear is that hesitancy in being visible on some of these things that we've talked about just now is in fact that the concern that you need to be ready for regulators if you're very clear about what you're doing. And so I hear you on the sort of, well, healthcare is regulated and there are other sectors that are heavily regulated, but that is something that we hear. Do you think that's, is it inviting regulators to then come in? You have to then be extra ready for looking at everything that you're disclosing. So that was a question, because I think that is something we hear across the sector. On the UK, it's interesting to observe the differences in the regional performance across the whole index, but specifically in the leadership pillar of the index, looking at this fresh data. We have seen in last year's index, the European banks slightly behind the North American banks. And what we were sort of observing and hearing in the conversations that we had across and with the banks was that there was sort of just a slight delay, right? A slight delay in investing, in changing organizations, in thinking about strategy and funding that strategy. but maybe by sort of a year and a half. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing coming through now, right? That there is, as Colin was saying when he was showing the data, this sort of wake up to, we need to get on this and put all of these things in motion, which also includes the making what they're doing much more visible. So we're seeing this major uptick activity in the UK banks in particular. So that sort of, I just guess that just supports that hypothesis that there is a slight lag with the European banks following the US banks. But I think maybe handing over to you, James, on that question on the sort of the regulation, and you sort of partly answered it already.
So I think of all the stakeholders, the regulators are the ones that I would worry least about in terms of publicizing things and putting things into the public domain. I think the notion that banks wouldn't share something because they're worried about incoming from regulators is somewhat flawed. This day and age, I don't think banks would be doing something that they didn't think regulators were comfortable with, let alone publishing and publicizing it. All banks work super closely with regulators, and guess what? Regulators are very switched on to AI. So the amount of questions that they'll be asking and the dialogue that they'll be having, they'll have seen everything before it hits the press release, one would hope. So I don't think that is one of the reasons that people wouldn't. I'm sure others have alternative opinions to that.
Well, I want to reserve 15 minutes to talk about executive positioning and basically pivot to who are the voices that's really driving this surge in the individual mentions, and anticipate the question, to what degree are the voices equal or not? And when you look at it through an institutional perspective, who gets outsized influence when you bundle it all together? So I'll try to be very, very brief in terms of the data plugs for the report. But basically, at this point, we've identified 41 out of 50 of the index banks that have at least one individual on the executive committee that drives the tech or AI agenda, whether that's defined as the CTO, the CIO, the COO, chief digital officers, chief analytics officers, et cetera. This has not changed, to our surprise, significantly year over year. Structure appears relatively fixed, plus or minus kind of a handful of banks. And I think more importantly, when we rack and stack all of the individual C-level titles that are engaging with external media on the topic of AI, we get to a fairly high number of 94 distinct kind of execs engaged in the conversation. But not surprisingly, not all of those voices carry equal weight. And shocker, CEOs dominate the conversation. They make up less than 30% of the executives that we're tracking in the media, but they drive 75% of the resulting press coverage. And I profile this as like kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that what we found regarding the substance in direct communication channels carries over to what we're observing in external media channels. So among those 94 C-level leaders, 51 or over half are engaging with a high degree of specificity. They've moved past kind of the vagaries and generic industry trends, and they're quickly pulling back the curtain on what work is in flight at the bank regarding AI. And that's actually very consistent, regardless of what CXO title we're putting under the microscope. I think the counterpoint to that, or the bad news, is that all 50 banks are not equally represented in the external media. While the channels we were describing previously in AI narrative, those tools are accessible by all banks, external media is obviously not a level playing field. And to demonstrate this, what Evident did was we reviewed 7,000 financial news articles sitting at the intersection of AI and banking going back 6 months. We pulled all of the quotes, we associated the quoted party with their respective employer and filtered that down to the 50 index banks. And what was interesting, and Ken stole my thunder a little bit, but it's okay. The top 10 most quoted institutions, the top 10 most quoted banks in terms of external media influence were just 6 institutions: JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. These are, with the exception of UBS, these are predominantly US institutions. And what we see is they have multiple voices that are amplifying those same stories. And some of them are part of more the research team than obviously they are the people that are the heads of AI. And that's definitely adding kind of bias into what is the story that's coming through on the external media channel. But the last thing we did was we also looked at the amplification of these interactions with external media on LinkedIn, because one of the most common methods to boost engagement is to repost an interview or a video clip with a senior bank executive. And again, if you look at the top 10 banks in terms of the overall reactions that they're getting through their leadership's LinkedIn posts and their group level LinkedIn posts, there's only 3 banks that are on both lists, Goldman Sachs, UBS, and JP Morgan, that seem to achieve outside influence in the media and outside or a dominant share of that amplification in the echo chamber that is LinkedIn. In fact, those 3 banks, again, Goldman Sachs, UBS, and JP Morgan, now control basically 16% of the AI conversation specific to these institutions on the LinkedIn platform. So a very skewed view in terms of a very few number of institutions really taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room at the end of the day. Questions on this topic is that, with regards to that lack of structural change, it was very hard to pick up a financial media publication over the last couple months and not read a story about the rise of the chief AI officer. And we've identified like 150 CAIOs across lots of those other industries that we were talking about earlier. They're present in big tech, they're present in material science, they're present in aerospace and defense. But we're not seeing that to the same degree at all in financial services. And I'm just curious, why do we think that this rise of the CAIO is not taking root in this industry versus the other industries that we see it in? James and Alexandra, I'll start with you because, go ahead, James.
So let's go back to what I said at the beginning. There's been an evolution of thinking of how we talk about AI. It's changed a lot in the past 18 months, thanks largely to generative AI. We've had this shift from an AI strategy, move from a novelty to a necessity. So what we've seen with that is the level of expectation around where and how AI is going to be integrated has changed quite significantly. The task is no longer to find the niche cases or these narrow but high value cases scattered around organizations. The task is actually has shifted, and it's now thinking about how do we integrate AI across our organizations, both horizontally and front to back. So AI has kind of moved from being, let's call it the cherry on top, to actually being the cake itself. It's not another person's job, it's the existing people's job to get that right. And I think that's why we're not seeing it in banking, that people feel ownership of it. They own the stack, they own the businesses, they own the functions. They're the guys who need to integrate this, not somebody else.
Yeah. And Alexandra, put another way, do you think the lack of this new role or new title, is it a good thing or a bad thing for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, very much to James's point, right? That what we have observed is actually, if you do have that delegated to one person sitting somewhere in the bank, it's actually a sign of, immaturity, right? It's something that banks did very early on in the journey. They would have a sort of a head of a center of excellence, and it sort of sat a little bit outside, right? Outside the banking sort of business as usual. And to James's point, the evidence of maturity is that it's cross-organizational, that it's deep in the lines of business, that it sits, yes, there's a central team that sort of sits across the C-suite that are all figuring out what that strategy is going to look like, and everyone's on the hook for different things because it's so much part of the whole body of the organization. And then it goes into the lines of business, so it's also federated out, so that responsibility is not just at the top, but it's also at the bottom. And this banks are really working out, and I know James can talk about this, is a lot in terms of that perfect balance between a centralized, how much do you centralize, how much do you federate, because you don't want to create bottlenecks by having decision making too central, and you don't want to replicate what is going on in lines of business by not having by a system being too federated. So you want to not risk the duplication of efforts. So that perfect balance, I think, is something that all banks are grappling with. But to hand it on to one single person with that responsibility would be too much and not the right for a mature bank, would not be the right thing. So I think, and that's definitely something we see in the data as well. And that's something we've seen change a lot sort of over the last 3 years till today.
And Ken, I was going to ask the follow-up question to this, is that, in the absence of the CAIO, are there other C-level titles that analysts are more interested to see get into the mix to answer either operational or technical questions when we look at Investor Day presentations, when we look at all of the other collateral? Do you see a changing of the guard that you might interpret things through the lens of kind of org design or org maturity?
Yeah, a few thoughts. First of all, I still wouldn't rule out there being some chief AI officers down the road. 10 years ago, we only had a CTO. Now we've got a CIO. Now we've got a CDO. So I think, there's been more roles of seniority created inside organizations over time. And just coming back to our point of evolution and time continuum, we'll see. But I agree with the prior points about where does it live and how does it come up? And so on that point, so on the different C levels, one thing that's become interesting to me is when I go visit banks at their headquarters, you used to see the CEO and CFO and the lines of businesses, and then you always make sure you see the chief credit officer or risk officer. Now you absolutely want to see someone from the tech organization, absolutely, whether that's the chief technology officer or the chief information officer. Does it have to be the head of AI? No, but it has to be someone in the technology realm who can speak about how the company is building AI into everything else, we mentioned earlier, is what's their cloud strategy? Where are we on data? Where are we on digitization? Where are we on automation? How is AI playing into that? So it becomes part of that whole ecosystem of understanding how is this organization moving forward with its body of all things related to tech. Then as you think about these business line points, I think a point that was kind of brought up before is really important. I'm very interested in hearing from the business line people about how AI is looking. But if it's a bunch of vaporware potential or AI washing, then I'm not so interested. I think now we're starting to see a lot of press releases from different companies that are putting out a new product, and there's a comma second part of the sentence that says, powered by AI. So it's not even clear that it's an AI solution, or is it being branded as a kind of ancillary, or sits next to some AI part of it. And so I think that if we're going to see more and more line of business people come about, then I really want to see those proof points. I really want to be those tangible measures of this is what we are doing and this is where it is in. Not so much the whole we think it will have application in all these big picture. That's where I think tangible evidence becomes really important as more C-suite conversations come up. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of either repetitiveness from the top of the house, or arguably maybe a little bit hot air that's not necessarily real provable and just talking points for the sake of talking. And that's when you get into that concept of AI washing. And I'll make the parallel to, I think we saw a lot of this with ESG a couple years ago. Where there's a gigantic groundswell of everyone needing to get pushed out on it, and we've obviously seen the 180 or sort of a 180 what's happening on some of that as well. Not saying that's a direct parallel, but I'm saying there's some thought process around that could be applicable here.
Alexander, I would remind you, as CEO and founder of the company, you don't need to raise your hand.
I'm trying to playing by the rules. I'm going to take my hand down. I just got two really quick points. It's very interesting, this sort of the labeling of powered by AI, and it just made me think back to when we started the index and thought about the methodology and had conversations with the banks on how we, to structure it and what data sources to use. And what we heard again and again was this hesitancy about talking about AI or putting AI anywhere near something that was visible, because the customer and anyone picking up from it on the media side would be, oh, but it's not trustworthy if AI is involved. It's going to be something that the customer might worry about. Actually, I think there's been a huge change in a very short time, where I actually think the customer, particularly the younger cohorts, are expecting that AI is going to be there. They're expecting to see banks implementing it because they want the ease, they want the speed, they want a better customer journey and higher customer satisfaction from that, right? So I think there has been this change, that it's been a sort of the pull of expectation has changed, right? That wasn't maybe there 3 or 4 years ago, where it was more sort of a concern. So I do think that there are a lot of dynamics around what we're seeing in this data change so much over the last 12 months. We mentioned investor expectations. We mention what's expected from shareholders and investors and the media. But I also just think the customers have different expectations around. They might even trust things that are AI driven more than they would trust something that's a human in the loop. And I think that's changed a lot. That was the main point there. But back to you, Colin.
So there's one, we're in kind of the last, we're in the last 7 or 8 minutes of the call. There's one jump ball question from the audience that I think brings this almost full circle to where kind of James started off with Gen AI being the trigger. Peter Scott and Simon Torrance are having this conversation in chat that is centered around the idea that, increased discussion and investment by banks in Gen AI has also served to maybe lift all boats in the form of putting a spotlight on traditional or classic AI or predictive AI. And I'm wondering if anybody can comment on whether or not we think that's valid or invalid, because Ken, that seems to be like the opposite point that you were making, that you don't want to talk to line of business owners if they don't have anything to say, but if they have something adjacent to say about AI, that could be very substantive, even if it's not as buzzworthy as the thing that is disrupting the industry, or what's causing the most exposure to new risks as Gen AI becomes more and more commoditized and lower cost over time.
Yeah, I think we are focused on each bank's tech journey overall, and we want to understand as best as we can that a bank is on board and moving forward. And coming back to what we talked about before, big banks always get the lead because they have more dollars to spend and they can spread that around their cost base a little easier. But then what happens is that you have a lot of fast followers. People learn from the big banks that they then pick up either some people or some ideas or some context. And then the small banks, do it. They do it through vendors. And we could debate to no end if that's an ever emerging gap between large and small. But I think we've seen enough evolutions of different technology advancements over time where we're sitting here and there's still thousands of community and mid-sized banks that are competing with the big guys as alternatives to them. But it gets a little harder and they have to fight and figure out the way to evolve. So I would say that it's all about, can you find the money and the know-how and the expertise to continue on that overall journey? And if not, how do you figure out how to get it? And if not, that's why consolidation happens in the bank world as well, and has for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a beautiful synopsis of why and how leadership relates to talent, relates to innovation, relates to all the other things that we're measuring when we pull up a level. James, final word from you. I was wondering, you talked about the necessary of and the time that it took to build substance before you could engage in the conversation. Are there any other prerequisites that come to mind to do what we're measuring well from the bank's perspective?
I guess the main point is around thoughtfulness of your stakeholders. So who's going to be reading? Customers, investors, employees, regulators. The narrative that you put out must appeal to one without harming the other. Very tricky to do that in some circumstances. So you need to have, like the obvious, you need to have a clear strategy, clear purpose and authenticity in your message. How is it improving the customer experiences? How is it improving the efficiency of the firm? How is it furthering finance as an industry? Ken makes it very clear you must have tangible and very specific outcomes. You can't just put these empty comments. You must have real things. I think you have to be thoughtful about your consistency across your channels. You can't be putting stuff out on your socials that's the opposite end to what you're putting in your investor relations pieces or in your press releases. So you need a sound stakeholder awareness, you need a clear and a unified strategy, and you need to be willing to educate each of your stakeholders on that journey. And that, I think, actually is something that any bank can do of any size. So there's a question on the page around a level playing field. No, it's not a level playing field, but you can all craft your own story, and you can craft a very compelling narrative focused on your specific strengths and your specific customers. And you saw that in your leadership report. You even mentioned there's a disconnect between the narrative that's coming out and some of the other parts of your the index. And I think that demonstrates that people can score well in this if they've taken the time and the thoughtfulness up front.
Wonderful. And Alexandra, last question before we go to housekeeping and close up for today. There's an interesting question in the chat also about how much of what we're seeing is being driven by the banks identifying Gen AI as having true value versus the perception of not being part of the conversation makes you by default a laggard or behind the times. It's very similar to my last question, which is like, as following up from prerequisites, does AI maturity breed strong AI leadership, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, it's a good. I actually had thank you, Colin. I'm going to answer. I mean, in a split second, if I could just do two quick points on something that Ken picked up and something that James mentioned. This question on impacting the bottom line that you talked about before, and sort of mentioning the ROI, but there's so much noise also going on, and there's so many other things that determine where the share price is going and the financial performance of the bank. But something that we are starting to see is that it's loose, but this correlation between AI maturity. I mean, in principle, there should be a correlation over time between the maturity and the application and the implementation of AI and the ability to raise revenues and cut costs. And so we're seeing a lot of noise. I think that, will always be the case, but over time, and that speaks to your sort of point on consolidation, we should expect to see that correlation to tighten, I would imagine. And I would imagine that's something that you'd be looking at as well. On the fast follower question, I think that it's a debate we have a lot about the leading banks and the fast followers and the argument for being a fast follower. But there is also this question that goes back to Colin's question around, there's a lot more than just picking which large language model to fit with what use case, because there's a whole question of what is integration ready, right? The data, the governance, the risk, the whole sort of journey that a use case has to go through from ideation to production, and making sure that all of those parts along the way are cleared and make it sort of as seamless as possible. So there is, of course, that then comes down to what talent you have, but it also comes down to what, vendors that you use or what you build at home, or you choose to pick as vendors. But that integration readiness is, as someone put it some weeks ago, that's 90% of it. And then it's sort of identifying the use cases and deciding what large language models to use and so on is maybe only 10%. So I do think that also takes a lot of time. So my point here is just that one can be a fast follower and learn a lot and pick it up and move. But I think there's also a question of time. One can't let that, take too long, right? There's a point in time where that stretches too long. But I know we need to get to housekeeping, Colin.
We will. And I would just add that there's some new, for answering the question on whether Gen AI holds value, there's new outcome indicators in the index that's being published next week that will have a whole dedicated chapter to it. And we have 3 times as many banks talking about this year than last year, which is a positive sign. So with that, Alexandra, can you take us through housekeeping? And again, a huge thanks to our 2 panelists, Ken and James. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. I know it was very much valued by the attendees of this webinar.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Ken and James, for that was really great to get your perspectives. Just as we close, just want to share that we release our newsletter every fortnight called The Brief, and please do subscribe to it by going onto our website and just subscribe to The Brief from there. We cover everything from data from the index to talent matters, where sort of who's moving and being hired between and in the banks. We also look at a use case corner that we have, and we also have a corner now that looks at the latest models and what they're doing, because it's moving at such a fast pace. So we decided to track that as well. So please do sign up. And last but not least is that we've got our AI symposium in New York taking place on November 21st. Anyone who's interested in joining either in person or virtually, please do get in touch. We are releasing the program tomorrow. So do go on the site and see what we have in store on November 21st in New York. And again, just as a reminder, the index is going to be released on October 17. So do watch out for that as well. We'll be sending a press release out and it'll be available on our website. And thank you so much for joining. It was such a pleasure to have you all participate. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Colin, for the great handling of the data and questions. Ken and James, for your time.